Session on free speech on campus. This is a very hot issue on many campuses and a very important issue, both for the issues it raises about free speech and free exchange of ideas, also in terms of public perceptions of higher education, in that many who question higher education are very focused on this issue. So I want to start by just providing a little perspective and context before introducing our panelists. They are all going to be reasonably brief so that we have lots of time for you to exercise your free speech rights and to ask questions. So the first thing I want to say is that free speech has become a very important, contentious issue on campus, in part because some speakers have been shouted down or disinvited. I think a crucial thing to keep in mind, though, for our coverage, and certainly it's worth covering when this happens, is that that is actually the exception that proves the rule. At most campuses, well, not today because of lots of campuses have already graduated, at most campuses, most days, there are controversial people who speak. And I worry that some of the press coverage of this issue gives the impression that nobody who is controversial these days can speak. And to give an example that I think is particularly telling, the same night that the incident with Charles Murray at Middlebury, which you'll hear about more, took place, there was also a speaker who was controversial at Franklin and Marshall College. He was the editor of the Danish newspaper that published the cartoons of Muhammad. And so lots of people don't like him. And the Muslim students at Franklin and Marshall weren't happy that he was invited. But they met with various officials. They protested silently during the event, holding up signs and turning their backs, but not preventing him from talking. And others protested more loudly outside. And it's not that I think we shouldn't write about the issues of disruption, but I think some context is important. I also think it's important to remember that while much of the focus has been on students heckling or demanding that certain speakers not appear, there's been a real issue in the last year of faculty members being harassed for their speech. Generally the pattern has been left-leaning professors, many of them women, many of them members of minority groups, who tweet or say things on social media to their friends that are seen as sort of not surprising within those communities, that then turn up on Breitbart with and become quite surprising. Demands that people be fired. Some have lost jobs. There's a parallel issue with regard to faculty free speech that doesn't get covered. I also think it's important to note that for those of us, I'm guessing that journalists have a bias in favor of free speech. It's hard not to. Our profession depends on it, and so I'll just come out and admit it. But if we care about that, I would argue we should care about all kinds of people whose speech is denied. And so there is a sort of narrative out there that conservative speakers are denied the right to speak on campuses. Many of those same people were not the least bit concerned when Harvard revoked a fellowship for Chelsea Manning. Now, she was going to speak and express her views at Harvard. And it is just interesting to me as we write about free speech, are we really free speech purists, or maybe not always? So those are some of the things that I just want to provide as background. Now to introduce our panelists, we're going to start to my left with Brandon Busteed from Gallup. And Gallup has done several surveys that touch on issues of student attitudes about free speech, and also done surveys on the reasons that people who don't like higher ed don't like higher ed. And that may also come. Then to my right, we have two scholars who are going to share their perspectives on this. Linus Owens from Middlebury, and Jane Kirtley from the University of Minnesota. And then at the far end, we have Josh Blackman, who is a scholar, law scholar at the University of South Texas, who was recently shouted down himself in a speech at CUNY Law School. So we will hear, and the topic of his speech was campus free speech. So we have a lot going on. There's been some joking prior on what would happen if we are shouted down during this session. And so I'm hoping that doesn't happen, but my colleague Greg Topo is here so he can cover it if it does happen. But that does mean that Greg cannot become part of the news and himself shout us down. So with that, let's get started with Brandon.
Okay. Well, we didn't have the perfect AV setup, so hopefully you can hear my voice without the microphone. I'm going to just give you a very quick high-level overview of a study that we just completed about 6 weeks ago on behalf of Knight Foundation. It's a study of currently enrolled college students, a representative study. We did a stratified random sample at an institutional level, and then did a random sample within those institutions. And so I'm going to give you some high-level overview of what they have to say about this. We actually conducted this survey now for the second year in a row, so we do have some comparison between 2016 and 2017. And one of the questions we asked them was whether they see whether or not First Amendment rights are secure. And compared to 2016 and 2017, on every single one of the First Amendment questions that we asked them about, they feel that they are less secure today than they were in 2016. The biggest drop, as you can see, 21 points in 1 year around freedom of the press. That is a dramatic change in survey research in 1 year. Almost all of that drop is driven by Democrat or Democrat-leaning college students. So I'm going to give you some of the nuances here. So that drop is primarily all Democrat students in their feelings that freedom of the press is less secure. We also asked them, interestingly enough, about trust in the media. And overall, trust in the media is up among currently enrolled college students since 2016, driven primarily by Democrat students who are Democrat or Democrat-leaning by party affiliation. We also know, and this was one of the interesting findings that several people wrote about, college students value both inclusivity and diversity and free speech. They care deeply about both of these things, and you can start to see evidence of where they come into tension in rather complex ways. So in any event, we asked them, this was a question that some people were like, well, this isn't really a fair question. I think it's a great question because it helped kind of force them to think about where they stand. So we said, okay, if you had to choose which you value more, inclusivity and diversity or free speech, what do you say? Overall, slightly more college students, if you look at the whole population, value inclusivity and diversity over free speech. Now again, they value both, right? So these are not necessarily mutually exclusive. That's an important thing to kind of take into account here as you think of the data. But you can also see where the divides are. I mean, look at the differences if you just look at overall, right, versus women, blacks, and students who are Democrats, basically driving the feelings about inclusivity and diversity being something that they value. Very big differences here if you break it down by these different student demographic types that we're showing you. Interestingly enough, and this probably won't sound surprising, most students, strong majority, 87 and 83%, support campus policies like free speech zones and safe spaces. They're much more mixed, though, on things like speech codes, right, where you see kind of a 50-50 split in their views of that. What I found interesting was that there is very little awareness among students about whether their campus actually has any of these things. So, here's an issue that's written about a lot, that's talked about a lot, that they care deeply about by way of how they've answered other questions, and yet when you ask them, well, does your campus have one of these policies, there starts to become a lot of confusion. Not sure, don't know, right? So it's kind of interesting to see that. We also asked students whether they felt uncomfortable on campus because of something they heard in reference to their race, ethnicity, religion. And I thought this was interesting because you can see overall about a quarter of students reported feeling uncomfortable. But then you see slightly higher percentages among women. Look at black students, 43%. But notice the difference if you look at black students at non-HBCUs compared to HBCU students. The HBCU students, of which are about 83%, I think if I got that data right, are black students at HBCU, so it's not 100%. but you can see they look like the national norm on an HBCU campus. Blacks on a non-HBCU campus, which is any other campus except HBCUs, 45%. And I also thought it was interesting that there was such a high percentage among students who reported being Jewish, 38%. So some interesting variations there. This was one of the points, too, that I think that there is some kernel of truth, right, about some of the critique from the conservative side of the aisle about higher education, right? It's liberal bias, so on and so forth. These are the stories that have been written about in the conservative news. We asked students overall their perceptions of whether certain groups on campus were able to, freely express their views. And you can see the least likely, I mean, this is just of all students, they say least likely to express their views are political conservatives, below Muslims, below international students, below LGBT community, right? So kind of interesting data here that college students go, yeah, political conservatives are probably less likely to freely express their opinions. I thought this was interesting too because I think it speaks to what universities can do or could think about doing. The majority of college students report having these conversations on social media as opposed to on campus. And you think about the value of higher education, one of those values is it's a place where we can have these kinds of conversations relative to other places in the country, right? They're part of the mission statement, they're part of the kind of sales pitch around the idea of college in many places. And so it's not surprising on one hand to see a millennial generation, right, more likely to have these conversations on social media. But the opportunity, I think, for campuses to bring back this conversation on campus, in the classroom in certain ways, is something to think about. What we also know is that college students are starting to rapidly sour on the internet and social media. And this is across many dimensions. We've seen it in several other studies, but in particular this one, where you can see from 2016, their feelings that it's too easy for people to say things anonymously on social media, up, dialogue that occurs is civil, down. So there's some real changes in their sentiments around this. And you actually see, too, that when we ask them a broad question, students see the internet as being responsible for increasing hate speech. And they also believe that social media companies have responsibilities for limiting that. So there's some real interesting data that's coming up about their feelings of social media. Now, obviously, they're huge social media users compared to other, population age demographics in the United States. By the way, people who get the majority of their news through social media are less likely to trust the news. So there's an interesting differential here with college students in particular. Their trust in media has gone up in the last year, but in general, if you take college students out of it, people whose number one source of news is through social media feeds, they're the least likely to have trust in the media. So there's some interesting differences going there. So I wanted to give that high-level overview. I hope I stay within my 8 minutes, and I'm just going to sit down and listen to the rest of the
And I saw some people furiously trying to take down some of the data. If they give you their cards, you'll send them the whole PowerPoint.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you very much.
Yep.
So, Linus.
Okay, I'll be quick. I think I'm here to be the pro-protest voice, so that's my role. So I'm going to argue, or broadly, that students actually should be protesting more. But I also want to echo Scott's point that y'all in the media should be covering these protests less. And I'll make the point differently than Scott made it, because Scott said that you're overemphasizing rare events, which I agree with. But I'm going to make the case that you should not do it because you're doing a terrible job of covering it. That you're missing, you're not just overemphasizing rare events, but you're missing and distorting the actual issues that are at play, some of which touch on free speech, but not always. So for me as a faculty member who cares about this, it matters because I feel like the coverage that you produce, and you, I don't know you, probably not you, you're good, I'm sure, but others, right, not in the room. I think it hurts the students, even though sometimes it may help the specific cause that they're interested in. And the inverse, I think that it tends to help the broader cause, which not just quote-unquote kind of racist speakers, although those are the main ones that often get talked about. Even if, again, it hurts individual speakers like Milo, for example, I think. And so as a sociologist, I think that my read, especially a sociologist that studies social movements, my read of the primary thing that's missing in the coverage is the question of power. And this is power both inside the institution and external to the institution, and possibly thinking about critically your role as journalists and the kinds of power that you use and the choices that you make. I think when speakers come to campus, the question is rarely to change anyone's mind, and especially we use a lot of, I think, bad cliches to talk about the marketplace of ideas that treats debate as both neutral and that the goal is primarily about changing people's minds and reaching some kind of truth. And I don't think that's what most people on either or all sides are interested in, so by framing it that way, I think it misses what's truly going on. I want to jump on something that Brandon talked about in terms of discomfort, because I think one of the other issues that I've seen is this broad use of concepts, not just free speech or political correctness, but also the question of discomfort. And if you take power out of the equation, all discomfort looks equal, both in the way it is experienced and, more importantly, in its material effects on individuals and institutions. And I actually think discomfort trivializes a lot of the ways that speech and speakers affect institutions and the students who go to them. And it allows people to easily recommend that we should all be in spaces that make us, quote unquote, feel uncomfortable. I think that, again, ignores the fact that some people feel uncomfortable almost all the time in spaces, particularly at the kinds of elite institutions that somehow I work at. A couple more things. Scott said I should end on something positive, so I'm about to get to that. But I want to hold on one more thing, which I found interesting, especially when the events in Middlebury happened, we became front page news for national news stories, and the New York Times couldn't get enough telling our story. And so I'm struck by the conversation that's been happening in the New York Times op-ed pages recently, this kind of radicalization theory of the right, that shaming works to push them further and further to embrace the alt-right, and to think about how, again, the both sides fails there, because while it seems perfectly fine to shame college students for their politics and how that operates, and the expectation is not that will radicalize them, but that will pull them back. And again, I think this is a question of how power operates, both at the level of journalism, but also within these institutions. So I'm going to end on positive stuff. I have 1 minute.
Please.
Okay. I don't have to say positive stuff. But I think that one thing, especially at a place like Middlebury, I could tell you millions of stories about protest not as disruption, but protest as community building. If anyone were to come back and visit Middlebury today, you would see that actually the institution is way better than it was before Charles Murray visited us, despite the fact that all kinds of terrible things happened in the aftermath on all sides. That actually we talk more about hard issues. The student body is working hard, both shifting demographically, but also to embrace that demographic shift and push the institution to embrace it more. To go back to one more thing, this is negative, but that Brandon said about sort of I think as journalists, you should be skeptical about the narrative that conservatives tell you about being silenced. Anyone who's ever taught a sociology class knows that they're not silenced. They raise all kinds of questions. And also part of this is about when we frame the liberal bias of the academy, we miss the fact that polarization actually drove that in a particular kind of way. That a lot of my colleagues would be perfectly happy being conservative if the right hadn't moved so far. And so the kinds of debates that are actually being silenced on the conservative side, to the extent they're being silenced, are relatively small. And conservative students feel, at least at my institution, perfectly comfortable saying things that disagreeing with me and their other students in class. And I'll tell you other positive stuff during the Q&A.
Thank you. James?
Good afternoon, everybody. I always am a little taken aback when I'm introduced as a scholar. I've been at the University of Minnesota since 1999, but I really got my background and experience running the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press for 15 years in Washington, D.C. And I tend to approach these issues as a free speech First Amendment absolutist, which does not make me terribly popular at the University of Minnesota, a state land grant institution where you would think that the school exists by virtue of the existence of the First Amendment, but in fact it's often not regarded that way. I had my own brush a couple of years ago with this when just a couple of weeks after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, together with some other colleagues throughout the College of Liberal Arts, we organized a panel called Can One Laugh at Anything? And it was all about the whole issue of satirizing Muhammad and that sort of thing. And we had an anthropologist coming in and talking about images of Muhammad going back many centuries. And we had a full house, and it was a wonderful program. I can say so myself. I had a relatively small part in it. We had people that were identified as Muslims. We had people from a variety of backgrounds. All of the debate and discussion was absolutely civil. I engaged with 3 young Muslim students afterwards, and we had a long discussion about freedom of speech and rationalizing that with Islam, and I came away from it thinking, great, this is exactly what we should be doing. And within 2 weeks, we were being called on the carpet by the Office on Equal Opportunity, saying that we had created a hostile atmosphere at the university by virtue of having used the Charlie Hebdo cover that appeared a couple of weeks after the attacks. You may remember it had Muhammad weeping and saying, "Je suis Charlie, all is forgiven," in French. And what turned out was that most of this had actually been instigated by outside groups outside of the university community, but EOAA took it very seriously. I don't blame them, that's their job. And essentially they said that they thought that we were creating a hostile atmosphere on campus. Now, they had not attended the forum. They had really no idea what had taken place there. I think most of the people that had criticized it didn't either. But they'd been very upset about that poster. And that's what became sort of a cornerstone. Not the substance of the conference, but our ill-advised decision, according to them, to use this image, which of course had appeared all over the world, to advertise what we thought was an important event. And our dean at the College of Liberal Arts was called upon by EOAA to publicly denounce us for having been so insensitive. Now, I don't know how you feel about this, listening to this. I felt like I was in the middle of the Cultural Revolution in the People's Republic of China. I simply did not understand, what the problem was here. But I guess apparently it was that I was being insensitive to these concerns. And so there we are, and we were left with that. I raised all this to then pick up on something that Linus was saying, which was this issue of conservative students feeling under siege on campus. I had a couple of law students in a seminar I teach in the spring semester this past year, and one of them at the end of the semester said that mine was the first class in his 2.5 years at the university where he had felt free to express his conservative viewpoint. I can't believe that's true, but that's what he said. And he actually wrote his paper on this whole issue of conservative speakers being shouted down, heckled off the stage, and so forth. And I thought you might be interested in 2 proposals that he came up with as a way to deal with this. And one was to get rid of podiums and lecterns at speeches, because that gives the speaker a greater sense of importance and legitimacy, and that if you took them away, that the university could more readily disavow any support for the statements that were being made. The other suggestion that he had to avoid sort of the heckler situation that probably you're going to hear about in a minute is that instead of allowing students to sit where they chose in these auditoria, that they should be assigned seats at random so that they just be spread out all over the room. Now, I don't know if these are crazy ideas or whatever, but my point is that this is a student that was actually thinking in a very thoughtful way about how to balance some of these concerns about freedom of expression, maintaining a pleasant college environment, not allowing people to feel that they're being marginalized or threatened. I don't know what the answer is. I know that in the last couple of months, well, the past semester certainly, I've been speaking on hate speech in a lot of places, the Federal Bar Association, at the University of Minnesota Rochester, which is primarily a first-generation people of color school. It's a very small campus. When they have a convocation, everybody is there. And I spent about 20 minutes explaining to them about the basic notion that hate speech is actually protected by the First Amendment to the Constitution. They did not know that. And so for me, there's a lot of remedial education that could be done and should be done by journalists that are reporting these things. We should not take it for granted that people understand these fundamental principles First Amendment. And it's not a question of excusing or forgiving speech that is not protected, like true threats and incitement to violence. But it is trying to explain to people where the richness of the fabric of the debate in this country comes from, and how it includes supporting the right of people to express ideas that some of us find very hateful and very offensive. Well, I'll wrap up this very quickly by saying that a few weeks ago we sponsored a symposium at the University of Minnesota, my organization, the Silla Center, did, commemorating the 30th anniversary of the Hustler Magazine versus Falwell case. You'll remember that case. It was a critical case in protecting the notion that highly offensive satirical speech has to be protected. In this case, it was an ad parody taking off on an old Campari liqueur campaign depicting the Reverend Falwell discussing his first time, where he described his first time taking place in an outhouse with his mother when they were both drunk after they kicked out the goat. To First Amendment scholars, to media people, to cartoonists, because we had about 20 editorial cartoonists, all Pulitzer Prize winners that were there taking part. This is like, holy writ for us, because it provides such great protection for offensive speech that protects everybody from Stephen Colbert to certainly Hustler Magazine. But what I found very interesting was that we did get some pushback from people who were particularly offended by the cartoonists who were depicting Donald Trump in ways that they did not think were appropriate. So my point is there's a lot going on out there that extends beyond sort of the central question of just controversial speakers per se. And I would encourage you, as you're covering the stories, to try to do a little sidebar or a little backstory on the long historical tradition we have in this country of protecting speech that some will find offensive in the name of promoting public dialogue and debate.
Thank you. Josh?
Thank you. So, hello everyone. My name is Josh Blackman. I'm a law professor at the South Texas College of Law at Houston. So I'm here in two capacities. First, I write and speak about the First Amendment, and also I'm a case study in the First Amendment. I speak at probably 40 to 50 law schools a year on a range of topics. Free speech, federalism, separation of powers, anything you think of, I probably give a lecture on. And I'm some of an endangered species in this state. I'm a conservative. I'm actually libertarian, but people don't really tell the difference. I'm a member of the Federal Society. I did not vote for Donald Trump. I did vote for Bush. I did vote for McCain. Off the table. Okay, so we got that. I was invited to speak at CUNY Law School in New York on the topic of free speech, which is a topic I've given many times before. A couple days before I arrived, the students who invited me, it was a Federal Society chapter, said they're planning a protest. I think, wait a minute. A protest about my free speech lecture? I didn't think he was serious. I actually thought he was joking. I didn't believe him. I was like, all right, whatever. And then I get to the school a couple hours in advance, and they tell us that students are already forming the demonstration in the hallway. They brought poster boards, markers, and making their signs, and that they were going to protest him. Like, how many people are there? 3 or 4 dozen. Okay. So we get closer, and then the school security person comes up to me and says, we have to talk about your event. I said, okay. He asked me, what's your exit strategy? I was like, Iraq? What is this, my exit strategy? He asked, how are you planning to leave the building? And then I immediately thought of Middlebury. I told him I'm planning to Uber. He's like, okay, good, not the subway. I'm like, oh. It got real at that moment. So about 15 minutes before the event starts, the security person comes back and says, we'd like to escort you to the room. What do you mean? I don't need an escort. He says, no, we should escort you. So he comes down, he's by the elevator, and he starts leading me down this hallway. And then I hear in the distance this faint murmur. I'm like, oh, that sounds like a lot of people. And you can watch the videos on YouTube. It's had 25,000 views. I turn the corner. And there are dozens of people there, standing there, shouting, shame on you, holding up signs. They called me a fascist. They called me a white supremacist. They called me a Nazi. They called me an oppressor. Every word you can think of, they called me. I didn't care that they were in the hallway. That actually didn't bother me. They didn't block my entry to the room. Well, one guy tried putting his backpack at the door. It wasn't serious. I shoved him to the side. It was fine. So that was fine. I mean, I didn't really care in the hallway. But then they came into the room. I was like, okay, this is different. They didn't just stand in the back, they didn't hold signs, they actually came to the front of the room, standing literally inches behind my shoulder. 6 or 8 inches behind my shoulders. And holding up signs, calling me an oppressor and a racist and a Nazi, and every other word you can think of. I was like, okay. So the students tried to introduce me, said this is Professor Blackman, and they were shouting down. And what happened next is fascinating. The students behind me were actually shaming the other students in attendance. They said, why are you here supporting this white supremacist? Why are you here supporting him? They were shaming them. Let me tell you something. I had a similar experience that my colleague did. Afterwards, several students said, we were afraid to walk into the room because we didn't want to be seen as associated with you. They were afraid. They came in later. The numbers about conservative students hiding their beliefs is real. And even at a place like CUNY, which is to the left of Berkeley, this indeed happened. So anyway, they try introducing me, and they're just shouting over him, shouting. And finally, about 3 or 4 minutes in, I was like, okay, whatever. I say, it's a pleasure to be here. I always say that. And I was like, no, you're not welcome here. And they were yelling at me and screaming at me. And I let them try and get their energy out for 2 or 3 minutes, and they keep screaming and yelling at me. And then eventually I tried speaking, and I actually held up a piece of their propaganda. They had this little pamphlet they put out about me, saying how I'm a racist and how I'm a white supremacist and everything else. I said, look, let's talk about this, right? You made these accusations against me, and we talked about them. And the first issue was DACA. Now, actually, I think DACA is a good policy. I think it's illegal. I think it's a good policy. And I was trying to explain that to them. And then a student responded by screaming at me, fuck the law. A law student yelling at me, fuck the law. Okay. So I responded, let's talk about fuck the law. They gave me something. I had something to talk about. I said, let's talk about fuck the law. And after about a minute or two, I think the students couldn't take it. They had nothing else to say. They said, we've heard enough of this, and they stormed out of the room. And they apparently went to the dean to complain. That's what okay, fine. I didn't care. So eventually they left the room. I didn't know if they were coming back. I actually thought they might come back to disrupt me again. I didn't know. So I never actually got to give the speech that I wanted. They took about 10 minutes. I was somewhat quite frazzled. They were standing over my shoulder. I don't know how I kept myself together. You can watch the video. So I said, all right, let's do this. Let's take Q&A for an hour. I felt like an ambassador to a foreign country. That these students had never actually heard someone to the right of center on their campus. I felt like a foreigner, truly indeed. And they asked me questions about everything, about the Constitution, about federalism, about criminal law, about environment, anything you can imagine. And I literally felt like they were questioning an alien from a foreign planet. Like I had this passport to have safe passage to CUNY. But let me tell you the good part, right? One student who held up a sign the entire day saying that Josh Blackman is an oppressor. That's what it said. The sign said, "You're an oppressor." He actually emailed me afterwards. I gave him my card. And he said, you know what? Based on your lecture, I've decided you're not an oppressor. Whoa. If I changed one mind based on that debate, it was worth it. Now, there might be more. I don't know. There might have been more. But several students who I think were fairly conservative said, thank you. You gave us a perspective that we would not get otherwise. This is why this topic is important, right? There's Milo, and there's Ann Coulter, and I don't think Charles Murray is in that category, but you can put him there if you want. But then there are hundreds of other speakers who aren't Milo or Ann Coulter, who do have valuable things to offer. I wasn't there to change any minds. I was there to make people see things that they hadn't seen before. Excluding speakers from campus, denying them entry, a platform, to use a vernacular of the kids today, denying them a platform deprives students of this, especially in a place like CUNY or Berkeley, where they're not going to see this on their own paid faculty, right? That's why I do what I do. Now, I haven't even mentioned the First Amendment. This was a public institution, and they were, I think, prohibited from uninviting me based on viewpoint discrimination. But this comes up in different contexts. They say, aha, we'll charge you a $30,000 security fee. Okay, who's going to pay that? In fact, Berkeley right now is being sued for that exact reason. So I encourage you, when you do write about these things, don't just make it all about Milo and Coulter and people in that category. Also consider the far softer targets who don't have those sorts of views, who are trying to express different conceptions of the law, of philosophy, of politics, or whatever else that students should be allowed to hear. Thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to your Q&A.
So, one issue raised by that is a journalistic issue is when we use the term white supremacist. And I actually think there's an interesting dynamic in journalism in that some journalists are too quick to use it because critics say somebody is a white supremacist. Others seem fearful of using it about people who, in my opinion, are white supremacists. I mean, and it strikes me when reading about the Spencer visits that some publications seem afraid to use that terminology, and yet some are probably too quick to use it in other cases. So I just think that's an interesting journalism issue. I would now welcome your comments for this, or questions for this great panel. I want to thank you all. I thought great perspectives shared on a variety of sides. And if you could introduce yourselves as well for the benefit of our panelists. Yes, in the back.
I'm Ryan McKenna with the Sarasota Herald Tribune. And I read something recently that I thought was really interesting. It was about the Southern Poverty Law Center's hate group classification, which I had always sort of just taken, as sort of gospel in this regard to who's a hate group, who's not. I think this sort of is in Politico, so you're pretty, apolitical in terms of his perspective. But the argument was basically that the SPLC's classification is politicized and is sort of used as a weapon against conservative groups. I'm curious if you guys think that's something journalists should rely on. If not, what should we look to?
I can address it. So one group in particular on the SPLC list is called ADF, Alliance Defending Freedom. This is a group that's won several cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. They argue in favor of religious liberty, and that means they probably argue against abortion laws. They argue in favor of religious liberty, which means they're probably arguing against contraception laws. They argue in favor of religious liberty, that means they argue against same-sex marriage. They've been designated a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. They've been denied, for example, something as trivial as Amazon's affiliate program, the Smile, you get a lot of money donating to charity. I would seriously consider viewing that list with scrutiny. There are groups on there that probably deserve to be there, and there's some groups that really don't and we're getting burned by it.
I'd also just suggest having used the list, sometimes, but not all the time. The list has what the group considers evidence. And so if you click on a group and it seems like the only thing that is justifying it being there doesn't strike you as evidence of a hate group, by all means don't use it. They've been doing this for a long time, and they've got a lot of pretty unassailable evidence about groups about whom I'm not sure there is much debate about whether they're a hate group. I have noticed that when you quote them, even about such groups, not like the ADF, but others, there are a lot of people these days who have a Google News alert for Southern Poverty Law Center, and you'll get hundreds of emails calling you a not nice words. And so this has become politically contentious. Yes, Bill.
Yeah, I have a question related to Kate's comment. I think point's well taken. I think excuse me, Jane.
Jane.
That's all right, I'll answer to anything.
I think your point's well taken that journalists need to do a better job explaining free speech, including hate speech. But I'm wondering, what about colleges? Certainly the issues are taken up in the classroom, and certainly they're taken up in response to specific incidents. But what about things like the freshman seminar? I mean, you teach freshmen about binge drinking. Is there any notable effort on college campuses to expose students to free speech, including hate speech, as things to think about in their college experience?
I can't speak for the vast panoply of universities. I can tell you it's not being done at the University of Minnesota, except in some particular departments that have a very specific approach, very specific theology. I mean, students of mine who are majors in women and gender studies approach these questions on a very regular basis, but not, in my opinion, with the foundational issue of what the First Amendment protection is. I mean, they have a right to have any point of view they want, as far as I'm concerned. But the thing is, when they're telling me this is illegal, and I tell them, well, actually, it's not. It's telling me that they're not getting that education along the way. So, you know, at the moment, my department does a freshman seminar on the power of money. I really wish we could do something on the power of the First Amendment.
But you know, the other thing that I think journalists may be not exploring is when there are actual efforts out there. We ran a piece last week by a professor of Russian literature at Pomona, and it was called "Why I Still Teach Lolita." And the piece was prompted by her students asking her to remove it from the syllabus. Now, what makes this particularly striking is it was a seminar on Nabokov. and so it would have been easy for this professor to just say, well, that's silly. We're not going to not teach what is considered the masterpiece of this author. And if you sign up for a seminar on Nabokov, you can't expect not to learn about Lolita. But what she did is she wrote us an op-ed that was basically her lecture to the class about why she believed it was still appropriate to teach Lolita in the era of Me Too. And she didn't mock her students. She said she could understand that it would seem odd to be teaching a novel that glorifies the abuse of an underage woman. And all kinds of, she said she understood, and then she walked through a series of reasons why she couldn't, she had to teach the book, and why it was good to teach the book and good to read the book. And I do fear that there's a speedy instinct of many pundits in particular to just mock rather than teach. Now, I don't know if her students then got it, but it was a very strongly held opinion, but respectful of her students' discomfort. And I think there's a lack of awareness that you can strongly advocate for things and be respectful of those who are uncomfortable at the same time.
I'm the editor of Education at the Christian Science Monitor, and last August we did a piece on that. And Purdue University is one of the leaders. So they have, I think it's like their second year doing it. And the piece is titled, Welcome to Orientation Freshmen, here's a copy of the Constitution. So she kind of went over the Purdue one, but also some others. So just if you want to, you can check it out.
Yes.
And if I could I just quickly add, and of course, you know, the University of Chicago is, you know, for lack of a better term, manifesto about freedom of expression, First Amendment, and, you know, which is distributed to their entering freshmen, is another great example. So I don't mean to suggest that nobody's doing anything. The trouble is, I can't tell you what the substance of those kinds of programs are, and a lot's going to depend upon, you know, who's teaching them and from what perspective.
Yes, in the back.
Something we've seen in Arizona recently, they just passed, Rachel Lyman of the Arizona Republic, they just passed a law creating like a free speech committee. It's a model legislation that a lot of you will probably see in your states coming up soon. And I'm wondering, for those of you who see this as a real crisis on campus, are these laws going to affect the issue? I mean, creating committees or putting in place fines, things like that. Does the First Amendment need more laws to back it up? Or?
Sure, go first.
So I'm familiar with some of these legislations, and I haven't studied them too carefully. But one of the issues is one of discipline, right? Students who engage in acts of violence may or may not be disciplined. Students who disrupt protests probably aren't going to be disciplined. And it's an understandable perspective for the administration. They don't want to cause a riot on campus with disciplined students. But then that creates perverse incentives, as people will know. That if students know they can disrupt the speech, nothing will happen. They'll do that again, and they'll do it again, and they'll do it again. Now, I was able to stand up there for, you know, however many minutes it was, with people shouting and yelling at me. I'm willing to wager that some of my colleagues would not have done that. If they were asked about the exit strategy, they said, screw this, I'm not giving the lecture. Or if they saw 40 people in the hallway shouting, shame on you, they would have turned around. Now, maybe I don't have the medal of Charles Murray. Maybe I'll aspire to that one day, I don't know. But these sorts of policies punish speakers who lack the stature and strength, one could say, to handle this. And if there's no discipline to be had, that's an issue for state schools. Private schools are a different story. But since legislation concerns discipline, I think that is worth considering.
Linus?
I guess I would argue the exact opposite. That I think these are terrible, and these are efforts that sort of build on a larger attack and disrespect for college students as political actors. And I would also build on that and say that protest, I think, is actually over-disciplined in institutions. Students at Middlebury were punished way more for engaging in the protest against Charles Murray than rapists on our campus, binge drinkers, people who destroy property on campus. I had a student a couple of years ago who pulled up some American flags from a 9/11 event, and it blew up on Breitbart or whatever, and she was suspended. People demanded that she get expelled for pulling up little tiny American flags on the ground. And you can debate whether or not that was a good form of protest. But the point is, no one was hurt. People were mad, and people who have money and give money to the college made demands, and she got kicked out of school. And did she learn her lesson? Yeah, she learned a lesson, but it wasn't the one that the college wanted to teach. It was basically like, and this is what happened at Middlebury, is like at this moment of community building, what happened over the course of the semester is the college's disciplinary project tore that apart. Created students that felt no longer safe on campus, or they could trust the institution. I'll just say one more thing. It's leading up to it, I think the other thing is that students learn to be skeptical about the value of dialogue and reaching an outcome, and actually learn how power works. That at Middlebury, for weeks leading up to it, they were pleased to at least consider. The shutdown was not the original plan. The shutdown came out of the fact that the college, every time the students asked for something, they said, well, no, we can't do it, and it's actually for your own good that this happens, and we can't listen to you. So I think that students have a right to be not necessarily skeptical of whatever the First Amendment, which is different than free speech, and I think we should be careful about conflating those two, but about like the idea that dialogue reaches sort of, good outcomes if you just ask the right questions.
So just one very important point about these laws, well, one, they vary, so they're not all the same. But you might check out the website of FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, which is a pretty purist organization about free expression, and they have expressed real concerns that some of these laws actually would inhibit protest. And again, if you're a free speech purist, you should be in favor of the right to speak and the right to protest. And FIRE has argued that these laws go too far and cross a line. Calling something a free speech bill doesn't necessarily make it a free speech bill. So worth remembering. Yes.
I'm sorry, Max Larkin. I'm a radio reporter at WBUR. This always struck me as very tough and fundamentally kind of stuck conversation. I'm probably supposed to be neutral, but I'm a little more Linus aligned than anything else. Yeah, see. I guess I wondered, do you guys think ever about the economics of these things? I sort of wonder. In my reporting, I run into people on all kinds of campuses, and obviously there's a private-public divide here. But it strikes me that if you're paying $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 to go to the school, either in loans or in tuition upfront, it's sort of like going to Disneyland, right? And spending like $200 or $300 for the day. There's a reason they're cleaning that place up every 15 minutes. It's sort of like you don't want any disruptions. You're in a resort atmosphere, and it sort of runs. It might be said to run against the grain of the mission of exposing people to ideas that are uncomfortable, even unpleasant to them. It's University Inc., and the idea is to give everybody an amazing time. Then maybe Charles Murray isn't part of the resort experience, so to speak. Does that make sense? I mean, do we actually think this is a new thing? I sort of think it isn't, but if it were a new thing, it might be related to the fact that college now costs loads more than
I guess I would respond this way. I think you make a good point that the consumerist model, is often used to dismiss students, and I think we should take it more seriously. In every other context, consumers that is a form of power, but when it's students, we actually use that to denigrate them and dismiss them. And I think if they exercise that power sort of whatever unfairly, then that may be a problem. But I actually think that the student protesters are not the same. We shouldn't conflate them with the same ones who are kind of have the quote-unquote resort mentality. And I think that actually are not the same students. And again, I would be wary of using the language of discomfort to cover a whole bunch of things. And I think, and not just in terms of challenging ideas, but also just being comfortable in the space of colleges. And again, one of the problems of having someone like me talk about Middlebury is like this weird thing that like is completely unrepresentative of what the average college student and the average college is actually like. And yet it gets overrepresented in places like the New York Times because we send people who go work at the New York Times or are friends with people who work at the New York Times. And so they're interested in Yale and Harvard and the little Ivies in New England, and the rest of you, who cares? But having said that, I think, again, that becomes a way to dismiss this that I think is not fair, especially as colleges try to grapple with the demographic changes, both economically and racial on our campuses. That again, the people who want the resort experience, to the extent that they exist, are not the same people who are protesting.
Greg?
Just another question, kind of follow up on this. So you were talking earlier just now about coverage in the Times and whatnot. You said earlier something along the lines of, you guys are having a more serious discussion about these issues now?
Yes.
Post-Charlton. And I guess, I kind of don't know how to ask this question, so I'll just ask it sort of straight out. Does shame work in this case?
Well, I think shame works very well.
Okay.
I think for better or for worse. And I guess, so that's my quick answer. I'm not sure, like, who's being shamed here? The college? I think that one of the things that's interesting that I learned at this process is, again, like, there's a narrative about college professors being radicals or whatever. But college professors, at least on my campus, and again, there's a wide range of politics that if we weren't in a huge right-wing moment, would seem like a more diverse space, but they get pushed all to the left because the left becomes more and more inclusive of everyone who's not the right. But that they had a much easier time, even at a student-oriented school like mine, identifying with Charles Murray than with their students. And to think, well, there, but for the grace of God go I, right? Like that, like what if that happened to me? And so there was a shame that was going on there. I think the other shaming is that the college had to, but so that was one element. And I think people ran off and wrote a letter in the Wall Street Journal saying our students are terrible, basically, I thought. Because they wanted to save face in front of their peers, and they didn't, and they sold out their students in the process. But I do think the college had to come to terms. I think the flip side is, like, part of this is performative. Part of this is about healing and bringing the community together, which I think ignores some of the issues that actually were there to begin with. I think it's an opportunity for some of us on the faculty and staff and students to push it. And so my argument, of course, is that protest works. And that, and if people, the interesting thing is that still today, I mean, there's a free speech on college campus story, and half the time it's the picture from Middlebury. And I think it's supposed to tell a particular story. I mean, for me, I see it and I just feel enormous pride in the students that I know. But also I see the community being formed there and like the kind of work and like this, I mean, to be quite literal, this joyous moment for them, this empowering moment that they otherwise didn't feel on that campus and had actually been excluded from feeling on our campus. And I think that they were able, some of us were able to capitalize that to like push for things. But I think there's a counter push to like make it all go away. And so it's a moment, but it's not necessarily settled.
The counter push is very strong. I've had several college presidents tell me that when they meet with alumni, not Middlebury's president, that they get asked, could Middlebury happen here? And they don't mean the great foreign language instruction. and so this has captured, this was reflected in Brandon's data, this has captured some ideas. Tyler?
Thanks. Tyler Kincaid with BuzzFeed. My question is about how this narrative, how this debate plays out, and whether anyone thinks that this gets muddled, because a lot of the same people who are voicing a lot of concerns, or have been the past several years, about a free speech crisis in college campuses, are also constantly talking about things like trigger warnings and framing that as if it's a free speech violation, even though statistically next to no college requires them to be used. Things like the Brown incident, where there was a debate about sexual assault and rape culture, and they hosted an alternative event, and no one was prevented from speaking, but that gets framed as if it's violating someone's free speech. And meanwhile, those same commentators don't talk about Tennessee lawmakers year after year proposing legislation to restrict the public universities from hosting Sex Week. So to me, it seems like there's a lot of here going on about political correctness, and it gets, as someone who hasn't written extensively about this but reads a lot of them, I wonder if anyone thinks that it gets muddled where the line is between someone saying that idea or that opinion sucks and I'm going to tell you, or I'm going to host an alternate event, versus things that are actually an infringement on someone's rights and preventing them from speaking or holding ideas on campus.
Anyone else?
Well, could I just say that Linus made a point, I think, about that he thought that the marketplace of ideas as a model is a flawed one. Is that fair?
I did say that.
Okay. I disagree with that very fundamentally, because I do think that the way, it's not necessarily a question of changing ideas, but it's exposing students to a variety of viewpoints. That's what the marketplace of ideas is all about. I'm not so sanguine as to say that always the best ideas will eventually rise to the top and prevail, because I think history has shown us that that is not always true. But I am confident that that cannot happen if ideas are being suppressed, because certain people, certain factions, certain political parties at the moment don't like them. And it goes from back and forth, from left and right, and neither side, or any of these sides, are not immune from doing this. And again, I go back to my original point, which is, I think it is in part because they have been abysmally educated about what the First Amendment is really all about. And so for me, it's about education, and if the university is not about education, then I honestly don't know what it's for. And I'm a big believer in the example I gave you about our Charlie Hebdo panel. I mean, one of the things we said was, if EOAA really wants to do something in response to what we did, could we encourage you to provide funding to the Muslim groups so that they can have their own programs to counter what we did, to explain why what we did was wrong? They had no interest in doing that. And so to me, that tells me that there really isn't this desire to try to promote these diverse viewpoints. So and I think it does get muddled, and a lot of it depends on who is shouting loudest at the moment. Not disputing the need and the importance of protesting, that's not my point.
Can I be really quick and respond? I agree about the muddling. I mean, I think this is the question of power. And I think to the extent that students are skeptical of free speech and First Amendment things, I think part of that is born from experience, that there's actually, because it gets applied in these inconsistent ways, and that it seems like it's been weaponized in particular ways from all kinds of sides. In terms of marketplace, just a quick response. I mean, I think one of the things is like exposing the viewpoints is great, but like that knowledge, that science actually moves forward, that to some extent we've shown things are wrong, and I think having to constantly relitigate questions that have been shown in the literature to be wrong is a waste of our time as an institution and a waste of our students' time. I think there's valuable things to learn by reading wrong things, but that's different than bringing in people who are just going to spout wrong ideas, with the idea that we'll get them in the Q&A session, which again, like, rarely happens, and B, is a waste of our time.
Ben?
So, Scott, I'd like to just ask you a question. You began the discussion by framing this, at least in part, as perhaps some overreaction by journalists who fail to understand that some of these events of the speech may be prevented or suppressed, and choose your word. Those are rare. Now, on one hand, you could also say the old sort of story in journalism is, dog bites man is not a story, but man bites dog is a story. So it seems to me the fact that something is not happening on every campus every day, every hour, doesn't suggest the story. And what I would ask you is listen to some of this, some of the elaborate rationalizations for preventing people on a college campus from talking about the subject. Don't you think that's a story?
Oh, absolutely. I actually wouldn't argue for not covering it. I actually fear, take something Linus said, I fear that people care more about free speech at Middlebury than at CUNY Law School. And so, having written about both, my interest hasn't gone away in the time between Charles Murray and Josh speaking. When I say that I think there's some overreaction, it's more the lack of context. I think we have seen an uptick in the number of these incidents, and I think if you look at the Gallup data, we've seen an uptick in student tolerance of disruption, and those are both newsworthy. I'm merely saying that we shouldn't, as journalists, suggest that no conservative speakers speak on campus anymore, because in fact they do. And so we shouldn't suggest that no controversial speakers can appear on campus, because they do. And I think there's a different narrative from we're seeing more disruptions and changes in attitudes is one thing, to say it's impossible for a conservative to speak, which actually motivates laws that many free speech purists think go too far, is not being responsible. But I actually worry very much about the issue of only caring about it at so-called elite institutions. But I also worry very much about caring about it because what you have is the activists get involved. So the reason I wrote about Josh's case is I got an email from a critic of Inside Higher Ed saying, "You'll never write about this one because but the thing is, so I got it, and the beauty of actually Middlebury and that is they were on YouTube, so I could watch it, and I watched it and I said, oh, you know what, this critic is right. They did shout him down, and then I read some of Josh's columns and said, no, who I didn't really know before. I said, no, he's not Mr. Spencer either, and so it made sense as a story. But there is a little element of boy who cried wolf going on, in that some activists will send an email saying free speech has been denied when there was a protest outside that didn't disrupt, but that was actually just more free speech. And so sorting this all out, and I imagine it's particularly hard for local reporters who may not be, in my role, I have to be more immersed than I might like in the culture wars, and so it's like part of my daily existence. But I would imagine it would be very hard for somebody who's not, and all of a sudden you're getting emails accusing you of various things. But that's the great thing about this generation of student protesters films it. So you can see it.
Let me address her related point. There's one story that likely will never cover, which is students who aren't invited in the first place. When a person gets uninvited, that's a huge deal. But I can tell you from experience that often students will say, we want to invite person X, and the administration says, no, you can't do that. And that's a story which we will never cover, and it happens, trust me.
It also happens that, especially with the conservative speakers, is that often they're funded off campus. That's what happened with Charles Murray, and so there's a disadvantage for to bring, it costs money, and that money has to come from somewhere. So there's a whole bunch of people that have never been invited anywhere, either because they're too expensive or they're not interesting, I'm one of those categories.
You're invited to EWA.
That's right. It's my crowning achievement.
Yeah. Yes.
I'm Jessica Tansey. I'm at the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research, which is at the University of Chicago, but I can't profess to know lots about the debates there. But Brandon, earlier you showed a slide that had that students care relatively equally about free speech, and the second one was
inclusivity and diversity. Yeah.
So University of Chicago goes hard, and I know other universities might too on free speech. But students are saying off both. So do you know of anyone that is deeply tending to that conversation well? Because I will tell you, at the University of Chicago, the DEI conversations aren't going well, and they're slow, and like it's not an inclusive space, truly. And I've been in spaces where the voices that dominate are the voices you would expect. If this is what students are saying that they want, do you know of anyone doing both of those things well on campus? Anyone?
Well, I'll give you an example involving Milo Yiannopoulos. Milo is sort of fallen from favor, but he's still out there speaking and doing his shtick. He spoke at West Virginia University. Some said that the university should withdraw the invitation because he's offensive in various ways. The president took a free speech purist position and a First Amendment position, saying we're a public university, we're not going to uninvite him. When he came, he did something he does at many campuses. He insulted by name a professor, in this case a gay professor, sort of for being gay. Milo is also gay, but he likes to pick on gay people. And so the president of the university subsequently got involved with a social media campaign in which students, I forget the name of the professor, the hashtag was I stand with whatever his name was, or something like that. And people rallied around this professor, and they wrote tweets about how he helped them and made it an inclusive place. And the president of the university joined in that. And while some people were frustrated that Guy didn't uninvite him, he conveyed very clearly that that what Milo said was offensive, that it didn't stand for him. And I do think there is this ability that some institutional leaders wrap themselves so in neutrality that they won't call out people who speak. And it sort of goes a little bit, I mean, I was thinking about what happened at WVU when Jane was talking about, do places actually engage, as opposed to, it would have been very easy for the president of West Virginia University to just say, we're a public university, First Amendment rights, that's it. But because of his activity the next day, it became actually a community building affirmation that they weren't going to let some outside speaker bully a much-loved professor. And so you know, there are things people do. We're over, but I'll take one more question.
My question's about conflating the idea of free speech with the idea of First Amendment rights. With constitutional rights, and that's kind of between you and the state as opposed to you and me or you and a group of students. Can you talk a little bit about where that technical responsibility does and should lie, what universities can do with that responsibility, and also a little bit about their obligation to provide resources to people who come to campus, like security or
Well, you know, I mean, my mind is exploding here when I hear there's a distinction between free speech and the First Amendment. First Amendment, Congress shall make no law
under responsibility.
Okay, but my point is you can't say they're two different things because they're not. The issue here, I think, would be if you're talking about a state university, the state university is the government. As a governmental entity, the state university is not allowed to discriminate based on viewpoint. Can't do that. Forbidden under the First Amendment.
But students can.
Sure, individual students can. And the question about how much universities have to, for example, bankroll controversial speakers for the purposes of, you know, guaranteeing their security and so forth, that is still very much a subject of debate, as probably many of you know, you've talked to the cover. If we're in a private school, it's all different because they are not subject to the First Amendment. They are subject to whatever contractual obligations they have created with their students. If they're, for example, a religious-based school, I mean, they're protected by the First Amendment, right? And that includes their right to decide that certain kinds of speakers or certain kinds of topics aren't going to be allowed. The individual students can protest that, but of course that may endanger their ability to remain enrolled in the school. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Linus, do you want to also weigh in on this?
Sure, but I'm not an expert enough, so I probably won't. I mean, so I'll admit that, especially the legal stuff, I don't know. I mean, I think, but it's interesting, I mean, when we think about diversity, like the costs that are involved with security for some of these speakers, and how that, you know, if we think about these as strategies that are attacking higher education, you know, using their weak points, using their strengths, or I guess using their strengths to turn into weak points, I mean, this is basically a way to defund institutions by having them bankrupt security, which again, if we're really about creating a diversity of opinions, think about how many people could come for the cost of, you know, the security at University of Florida when Richard Spencer came. But I'm not a lawyer, so
So there actually have been a bunch of changes in the last year since the Spencer incident at UVA and then at Florida that have so far passed content neutral tests. So some universities have said, for instance, you have to be invited by somebody on campus because Spencer was visiting uninvited. And so there are ways, when Spencer went to Florida, the university didn't realize that it had no rules about who controlled the event. And so Spencer, and journalists should be very concerned about it, Spencer controlled press access to the event. And Florida has since changed its rules, so give it more protection, and other universities have done the same thing, and Spencer's actually having more difficulty than he has in the past getting places to invite him. But on the security costs, the key thing is, if a university says anybody who costs security may not visit, they might be able to defend that. The problem is, I don't know of a university that wouldn't be thrilled to have former President Obama visit. That would have security costs. And so where universities get in trouble is if they impose rules on some speakers but not other speakers, and public universities. Private universities also, though, get in a lot of trouble based on their own rules. A lot of private colleges write their rules, or wrote their rules before thinking about these sorts of things. And so that issue that Jane mentioned of the obligation is very real. It is a contract. Yeah. Now they can rewrite them as a private, but they can't rewrite them right after a particular speaker has said he or she is about to come. Josh?
Let me address the constitutional issue. The Constitution only applies to state actors, which is public institutions. But that doesn't leave private institutions off the hook. These are places of education where students should be exposed to a wide range of views. And if these institutions take policies that restrict only one subset of views, they are utterly failing their students, which is why I feel like an ambassador to a foreign country, because CUNY would never hire an originalist scholar, right? They would never hire someone from a different perspective. So don't let private colleges off the hook. I think Jane makes a fair point. There are other forces that keep private institutions from doing the sorts of things that have been done before.
Linus, you're writing stuff furiously, so I want to let you express that.
No.
Okay. So I want to close by just saying a few things. One, as we were joking before about whether there would be any heckling or disruption today. There has not been, but I do think there's been really interesting comments by a great panel, so please join me in thanking you. And at 5 o'clock, another session, Top Stories in Higher Ed. You want to